I had been camping enough times in my life to know what to expect. I knew what it meant to spend a few days in the woods, to rely on what you carried on your back, to set up a fire and cook over it, to fall asleep to the sound of crickets or the wind moving through the trees. I wasn't a professional outdoorsman, but I wasn't new to it either. That's why, when I look back on that trip and think about how things unfolded, I realize the warning signs were there from the very beginning. It started when I signed up for a guided camping trip. I had been wanting to get away for a few days, and I thought joining a group with a guide would be a good change of pace. I figured it would be a chance to relax and not worry about planning every detail myself. When you hear the word guide, you expect someone experienced, someone who knows the trails, the terrain, and the little things that make a trip run smoothly. You expect someone who has done it 100 times and could do it again with their eyes closed. That's not what we got. The man who showed up to lead our trip didn't look like much of a guide. He had the title, sure. He was introduced as the one in charge, the one who was supposed to show us the way. But as soon as I saw him, something felt off. His gear was all wrong. It looked like he had just thrown things together at the last minute. His pack wasn't fitted properly. His clothes weren't right for the weather. He didn't even seem to have good boots. And when we started unpacking at the trailhead to make sure we were set, I realized he had barely brought food. That was the first real clue. A guide who takes people camping but isn't prepared for camping himself. That's not just unusual. That's a big red flag. First, I tried to brush it off. Maybe he had some system I didn't understand. Maybe he packed light because he had done this so many times that he knew how to live off the land. But then I looked closer. He didn't have fishing gear. He didn't have a proper knife for cleaning game. He didn't even have cookware that would make sense for someone staying out more than a night. What he did have looked thrown together, like odds and ends grabbed from a garage shelf. Still, once we were on the trail, it was too late to turn back. We followed him into the woods. The group was small, just a few of us. Everyone else seemed focused on the idea of the adventure, trusting that since he called himself a guide, he must know what he was doing. But I couldn't stop noticing the way he moved. He didn't walk like someone who knew the trail. He stopped often, not to point things out, but because he seemed unsure. He kept looking at his map, then at the trees, then back at the map again. By the time we reached the first campsite, the sun was already low. We got to work setting up our tents, starting a fire, and getting dinner going. That's when things became clearer. All of us had food, freeze-dried meals, some fresh items that would last a couple of days, basic stuff to cook over a fire. He didn't. When it came time to eat, he pulled out a couple cans of fruit and a pack of beanie weenies. That was it. It struck me as strange because a real guide would know to prepare for more than that. A guide would carry enough food to share if needed, enough to cover emergencies, enough to show his experience. Instead, he just sat off to the side with his cans, while the rest of us cooked proper meals. I felt the first true ripple of unease then. Something wasn't right. The first night was cold. The fire helped, but when it burned down, the air bit at your skin. I remember bundling deep into my sleeping bag, listening to the quiet woods, and trying to shake the thought that the man leading us wasn't what he seemed. Sleep came, but not easily. The next morning, the routine repeated itself. We broke camp, packed our gear, and followed him deeper along the river. Again, his movements felt unsure. He hesitated often, checking his map like someone who didn't know the land as well as he claimed. He didn't point out landmarks. He didn't give advice. He just walked ahead and we followed. When we stopped for lunch, it was the same scene. Everyone else shared what they had: jerky, bread, fruit. The guide stuck to his cans, opening one with a cheap little opener and eating straight from it. He didn't offer anything. He didn't ask for anything either. He just seemed apart. That night, the cold hit even harder. We had brought a small portable heater to take the edge off in the tents. It wasn't much, but it helped. The guide, on the other hand, seemed unprepared for the drop in temperature. He didn't have a proper sleeping bag, just a thin one that looked more suited for a summer night than the chill of early spring in the woods. He sat by the fire for a long time, almost reluctant to leave it. At some point, he asked if he could share a tent. I remember the air in my chest tightening. I didn't like the idea. There was something about him that didn't sit right. Something about the way he hovered on the edge of the group, the way he didn't seem to belong to the rhythm of camping, the way his eyes lingered on things too long. It wasn't just that he was unprepared. It was that his unpreparedness felt deliberate, like he was here for something other than what he claimed. We didn't let him in. Instead, we shared some warmth by the fire, let him sit close until he finally drifted to his own tent. But I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me tense. Every shift of the wind through the trees felt heavy. I kept thinking about how far we were from help, how much trust we were putting in someone who had done nothing to earn it. The next day, the pattern repeated, and the unease grew. The guide wasn't guiding. He was just there, a man out of place, eating his cans of fruit and beans, walking ahead without confidence. By then, I was sure he wasn't who he said he was. A real guide wouldn't come unprepared. A real guide wouldn't move like someone lost. We made it through the trip, eventually returning to the trailhead and going our separate ways. He vanished into his truck without much more than a nod. The rest of us were too busy packing up and thinking about hot showers and real beds to give him much thought in the moment. It wasn't until later that the weight of it settled in. Looking back, it was obvious. The clues were there from the start. The man wasn't a guide. Not really. He had no business leading people into the woods. And that realization carried a darker thought with it. If he wasn't there to guide us, then what was he there for? The answer still chills me. He was there because the woods are the perfect place for someone with bad intentions. No crowds, no lights, no quick escape. Just isolation. Just people who trusted the word guide and followed without question. We were lucky in a way that nothing worse happened. We were lucky that all he did was eat his cans and pretend to know where he was going. But that luck could have turned the other way so easily. Now, years later, I can't go camping without thinking of that trip. Every time I see someone call themselves a guide, I wonder what's really behind their eyes, what's really in their pack. Because I know firsthand that someone who shows up unprepared isn't just careless. It's a sign, a big, flashing warning that something isn't right. That trip could have ended differently. It could have been the kind of story you read in the paper, the kind of headline that makes people shake their heads. Instead, it's just a memory that I carry, sharp and heavy. A reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up with a title, a canoe, and a pack that's all wrong, and waits to see if anyone notices. And I noticed, too late to change the trip, but early enough to never forget. I still remember that camping trip with my cousin like it happened yesterday, even though years have gone by. It wasn't some big adventure, not one of those long wilderness treks you prepare for months in advance. It was just a short weekend getaway, nothing more than a chance to set up a tent, light a fire, and spend some time outside. But the memory of that one night has stayed with me in a way that none of the bigger trips ever have. We didn't go far, just a couple hours drive from home, down roads that wound tighter and narrower until the trees leaned in overhead. It was early summer, that time when the days are long but the nights still hold a bit of chill once the sun goes down. The air had that thick smell of green leaves and damp earth, and you could hear the hum of bugs before you even stepped out of the car. We picked a spot near a small clearing, close enough to a creek that we could hear the water but not so close that the ground was soggy. The clearing looked like it had been used before. The grass was pressed down in patches. There were faint rings of ash where other fires had burned, and the trees gave just enough cover to feel tucked away without being swallowed in shade. It felt safe, ordinary, exactly the kind of place you expect when you say you're going camping. We set up our tents side by side, nothing fancy, just simple domes you could put together in 10 minutes. Mine was a bit older, with zippers that stuck sometimes and a floor that always seemed to let in more cold than it should. My cousin's was newer, smaller, but in better shape. Once the tents were up, we gathered wood, lit a fire, and spent the evening in that simple rhythm of camping, eating, tending the flames, watching sparks shoot upward into the night. The woods grew darker around us as the fire became the only light. The trees stood tall and quiet, and beyond the edge of the clearing the shadows were thick. You could hear the occasional snap of a twig, the scurrying of something small in the underbrush, the distant croak of frogs by the water. It was the kind of night where every sound reminded you how far from the city you were. We stayed up later than we planned, feeding the fire, staring into the glow, letting the silence of the woods settle in. Eventually, though, the tiredness caught up. One by one, we put out what was left of the fire, crawled into our tents, and zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags. That's when it happened. I don't know exactly what time it was. Sometime after midnight, long after the fire had died down and the sounds of the woods had changed from busy to still. I was deep in sleep, half dreaming, when I felt something against me. At first, it didn't register. It was faint, light, almost like the brush of a fingertip. In that half-dream state, I thought I was back home. I thought maybe it was my brother messing with me, the way he sometimes did when I was lying on the couch and he wanted to annoy me. I shifted, rolled a little, and it went away. For a moment, I forgot about it. But then it came back. Not just a touch this time, but a slow, deliberate movement. Something was crawling, slithering, inching along my skin. I kept my eyes closed, still caught in that haze between sleep and waking. I told myself it was nothing, that it was a dream, that I was still home, still safe. I tried to sink back into sleep, to push it aside. But the feeling grew stronger. It moved along my arm, soft but steady, with a weight that was undeniable. That's when it hit me. I wasn't at home. I wasn't on the couch. I was in a tent, out in the middle of the woods, zipped inside a sleeping bag. My brother wasn't there. No one was close enough to touch me. And yet, something was crawling on me. My eyes shot open. The inside of the tent was pitch dark, the kind of darkness where you can't tell if your eyes are open or closed. My heart was pounding. My skin prickled cold, and the crawling sensation was still there. I froze, barely breathing, every nerve in my body on fire. I didn't know what it was. My mind raced through possibilities. Spider, centipede, snake, each thought worse than the last. Slowly, with my chest tight, I tilted my head down. The dim outline of my sleeping bag gave just enough light from the faint glow outside to catch a shape. Small, segmented, moving. It was a caterpillar. That realization should have calmed me, but it didn't. In that moment, it was the scariest thing I had ever experienced. Not because a caterpillar is dangerous, it isn't, but because of everything that led up to it. The dark woods, the isolation, the shock of waking up to find something alive crawling on me when I thought I was safe in my tent. The way my mind had jumped to the worst possibilities. The fear of not knowing. I lay there, frozen, feeling it inch along my skin. Every movement made my stomach twist. It wasn't just the touch, it was the invasion of it. The reminder that out here, in the woods, there was no barrier between me and the world outside. No locked door, no walls, just a thin sheet of nylon and the hope that nothing bigger than a caterpillar decided to come in. I finally forced myself to move, slow and careful, until I managed to brush it off. I heard the faint thud of it hitting the tent floor, but even then, the fear didn't go away. I couldn't shake the feeling of it still on me, the ghost of that crawl lingering across my skin. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter, curled in on myself, and stared into the dark until exhaustion finally dragged me under again. The next morning, the woods looked harmless. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds called overhead, and the clearing seemed ordinary again. My cousin was already up, stretching, poking at the remains of the fire. The caterpillar was gone, probably crawled off into the grass as soon as I brushed it away. No sign of it, nothing to prove what had happened. But I knew. That night left a mark on me. It wasn't about the caterpillar itself. It was about the realization of how fragile the line is between safety and exposure. In a house, you don't think about things creeping in. Out there, you realize you're part of the environment, no different from the tree or the rock or the fallen log. Things move across you, land on you, crawl inside if they want. You're not separate from it. You're in it. Even now, years later, I can still feel that crawl if I think about it too long. The soft, deliberate movement, the cold shock of realizing where I was, the helplessness of lying still, trapped in a bag, with something alive moving across me in the dark. People laugh when I tell them it was a caterpillar, but I don't care. That was the scariest moment of my life. Not because of what it was, but because of what it reminded me. That in the woods, you're never really alone and you're never really in control. You're just another body among many, waiting for the night to remind you. It's strange the way certain memories stay with you. Some fade and blur together until you're not even sure if they really happened the way you remember. Others sit in your head, sharp and heavy, as if your mind refuses to let them go. One of the sharpest memories I have is from a camping and canoe trip I took about 20 years ago with my dad, my two best friends at the time, and their dads. It was supposed to be a fun trip, the kind of thing you look back on as one of those golden childhood adventures, but it ended up being something I can never quite shake. We planned the trip for weeks. It was one of those father and son outings where the dads thought it would be good for us to get out into nature, away from TV and video games, and spend some time learning about the outdoors. We were going to be canoeing a section of river that, from what I was told, could be tricky in spots. Nothing extreme, but not the sort of thing you just paddle into without knowing the currents and bends. Because of that, the dads arranged for a guide to meet us and show us through the more advanced section. When we arrived at the river, I remember being excited. The morning air was cool. The water had that steady sound of movement that made it seem alive, and all of us kids were ready for adventure. The guide showed up not long after. He looked ordinary enough, nothing that stood out in a good or bad way. Just a man with a rough look about him, someone you might imagine spent a lot of time outdoors. He had a small pack and a battered canoe of his own, and he carried himself in a way that made it seem like he knew what he was doing. We set off down the river together, the sound of paddles dipping in and out of the water filling the air. It was calm most of the time, with stretches where the trees leaned out over the water and birds darted across the surface. Every so often we hit a bit of rougher water where the current pushed harder and we had to pay attention, but with the guide leading us it went smoothly. It felt safe, controlled, like we were in good hands. During the day we fished. The river had plenty to offer, and between the dads and the kids we caught enough to feed ourselves at night. Cleaning the fish became part of the routine, setting up camp, building a fire, and preparing dinner. There was something satisfying about eating what you caught, the meat sizzling in the pan, the smell mixing with the smoke of the fire. We were proud of it. The guide, though, didn't join in. He sat off to the side, pulling canned fruit or beanie weenies from his bag. He didn't even seem interested in the fish we offered to share. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he just preferred his own food. But it struck me as odd even then, because part of the fun of camping is sharing meals, talking about which fish was biggest, who cooked it best, laughing over mistakes. He stayed separate, like he was there with us but not really part of us. The nights were colder than I expected. Out there by the river, the dampness cut through everything, and once the fire burned down, the chills settled in heavy. We had brought a small portable heater to help take the edge off inside the tents. I remember huddling near it, grateful for the little pocket of warmth it created in the otherwise freezing dark. It was on one of those cold nights that the guide asked to sleep in our tent. He said the night air was too much and he didn't have the right gear. I didn't think much of it at the time, just a man wanting to get out of the cold. But I remember the feeling of unease that flickered across my dad's face. He didn't let him in. Instead, he made an excuse and offered to share the heater outside the tent so the man could warm himself a little before bed. The guide accepted that, and that was that. At the time, I didn't question it. I was a kid and I trusted the dads to make decisions. But looking back, that moment stands out to me. The way my dad's voice shifted, the way he positioned himself between the tent and the guide, the way he didn't want to let him inside. It was subtle, but I can still see it clearly. The rest of the trip went on without incident. We paddled more sections of the river, camped along the banks, cooked fish, and laughed at the clumsy mistakes we made as kids trying to set up gear or start fires. The guide was always there, leading the way, eating his canned food, sleeping apart from us. When the trip ended, we thanked him and went home. I didn't think about him again for years. Fast forward 5 years. I was older then, a teenager, sitting in the living room when the news came on. They were covering a story about a man who had finally been captured after being wanted for years. His face came up on the screen, and I froze. It was the guide. There was no mistaking it, the same rough features, the same eyes. The reporter said he was a child rapist, that he had been on the run, and that he had been moving from place to place, blending in, hiding in plain sight. I remember the way my stomach dropped. My mind shot straight back to that trip, the nights by the river, the canned fruit, the way he had asked to sleep in our tent. Suddenly, all those little details that had seemed odd but harmless came crashing together into something that felt dangerous. He had been right there with us, right next to us. He had been close enough to hurt us if he had wanted to. The thought that haunted me most was how easily things could have gone differently. If my dad hadn't trusted his gut that night, if he had let the guide into our tent, if the man had decided to act. We were kids. We were vulnerable. We were out in the middle of nowhere, far from help, completely at his mercy. The dads were strong men, but out there in the dark with children sleeping, it wouldn't have taken much for something terrible to happen. For years after, I thought about how danger doesn't always look like danger. Sometimes it looks ordinary. Sometimes it sits by your fire, eats canned fruit, and offers to guide you down a river. That trip taught me that not every threat comes with warning signs you can recognize. Some are hidden behind normal faces, casual words, and small requests that seem harmless at first. Even now, decades later, I think about it. I think about how close we came to something we never would have recovered from. I think about my dad standing firm at that tent door, making that small choice that might have saved us. And I think about the news anchor's voice, flat and calm, describing what the man had done to others, while I sat there realizing he had once been less than 10 feet away from me as I slept. That camping trip was supposed to be an adventure. In a way, it was, but not for the reasons I thought at the time. It was an adventure that ended safely, but only because of caution and a little luck. And it left me with a lesson I'll never forget. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a guide with a canoe, smiling at you while he hides the truth of what he really is. I still think about that camping trip in North Georgia, and every time I do, I get this uneasy feeling in my stomach that I can't quite shake. It was supposed to be nothing more than a quiet weekend away from everything. Just me and a friend with a couple days off work, and the idea that we'd get out into the woods, set up a fire, and unwind for a while. Nothing fancy, just the kind of trip where you pack up the tent, a cooler, and some gear and head out until the cell service drops and all you hear are the crickets and the wind moving through the trees. We had driven up from the city, taking smaller and smaller roads until we reached a stretch of winding two-lane blacktop that looked like it hadn't been touched by road crews in a decade. Potholes, faded paint, and woods pushing right up against the shoulder. It felt like the kind of place where you could disappear for a few days and nobody would ever know where you had gone. That was the appeal, at least for us. By the time we rolled into the nearest little town, it was already late afternoon. The sun was dropping low, throwing those long golden beams through the trees, and we figured we'd grab our supplies before heading the last few miles to the campsite. We pulled into the only grocery store in town, one of those squat brick buildings with a faded sign that looked like it had been there for 30 years. The lot had maybe 6 cars in it, and the whole place gave off that small town feeling where everybody knows each other. Inside, the store was cramped, dimly lit, and quiet. We loaded up on the basics: bread, chips, hot dogs, a pack of marshmallows, and whatever else we thought we'd need for 2 nights in the woods. What we really wanted, though, was a case of beer. It didn't even cross our minds that we might not be able to get it until we were standing in front of an empty cooler and realized there wasn't a single bottle or can in the whole place. That's when we found out we were in a dry county. We weren't planning to get drunk or anything, but sitting around a fire with a few beers just seemed like part of the whole camping experience. It was disappointing, so we figured maybe we could find some nearby county line where the rules were different. The cashier, an older woman with tired eyes, gave us directions to a bar just across the county line. She said it was about 10 minutes down the road, straight shot, and that we'd know it when we saw it. We didn't think much of it. We just tossed the groceries into the back seat and headed that way. The road stretched on with hardly any signs, no gas stations, no houses close to the road, just woods pressing in on both sides. The light started dropping fast, the way it does in the south once the sun dips behind the trees, and before we knew it, the whole place felt shadowed. When we finally pulled up to what she had described as the bar, I remember feeling this cold unease creep up the back of my neck. The building didn't look like any bar I had ever seen. There was no sign out front, nothing to say what it was. The windows were all bricked up, every last one of them, like someone had gone out of their way to make sure no one could see inside. The only light came from a single bulb hanging above a screen door, throwing a pale yellow glow across the porch. The rest of the area was swallowed in darkness, and it struck me right away that this place was far away from everything else. Not another building, not even a streetlight in sight. We sat there in the car with the engine running, just looking at it. It didn't feel right. I couldn't imagine anyone calling this a bar, not in the usual sense. No neon signs, no sound of music or chatter spilling out, nothing but that silent building sitting heavy in the dark. The whole thing felt wrong, like we had taken a wrong turn and ended up somewhere we weren't supposed to be. We made a few nervous jokes about the movie Deliverance, laughing in that kind of way where you're really just trying to cut the tension you feel but don't want to admit out loud. The longer we sat there, though, the less funny it felt. I kept thinking about how easy it would be for something bad to happen in a place like this. No one would know. No one would hear. After a few minutes of just staring, we decided we didn't need beer that badly. We put the car in reverse, turned around, and drove back the way we came. Neither of us said much on that drive, but I know we both felt it. The thick, unsettled tension that clung to us until we were back at the campsite and had a fire going. The next day, we started chatting with some of the other campers. They seemed to be from around the area, and we mentioned what had happened the night before. When we brought up the so-called bar across the county line, the reaction we got was not what I expected. Two of them, separately, said that place was not a bar. They said it never had been, not in all the years they'd lived around there. Both of them gave us this look that made my skin crawl, like they were trying to piece together why we had even been there in the first place. One of them said it sounded like we had been lured into something, and that we were lucky we didn't go inside. That hit me hard. I kept thinking about how the cashier gave us those directions so casually, pointing us straight toward a building that clearly wasn't what she said it was. I thought about the bricked-up windows, the single light, the way the place sat in the dark with nothing around it for miles. I thought about how quiet it had been, like the kind of quiet where someone could be waiting just on the other side of that door. The rest of the trip, I couldn't shake that feeling. Even when we were out in the woods, cooking over the fire, listening to the night sounds, I kept replaying it in my head. I wondered what was really inside that building. I wondered what would have happened if we had gone up those steps, opened that screen door, and stepped inside. Looking back now, I'm glad we didn't. I'm glad we trusted that uneasy feeling, because sometimes that's the only warning you get. Out in the middle of nowhere, miles from help, one wrong decision can change everything. That weekend taught me that not every danger in the woods comes from wild animals or bad weather. Sometimes it comes from people and from places that pretend to be something they're not. We went to North Georgia to camp and relax, but what I remember most is that strange building on the side of the road. It still bothers me knowing how close we came to walking through that door, knowing that others thought we had been led straight toward trouble. And that's the thing about it, it wasn't some ghost story or campfire tale. It was real, and it was sitting right there in front of us, hidden in plain sight. That's what makes it scarier than anything else. I had always been the kind of person who brushed off warnings. Maybe it was pride, maybe stubbornness, or maybe just a streak of carelessness that had followed me since I was a kid. When I set out on that camping trip, I didn't think much of the little details, the things people usually take as red flags. I wanted a break from the noise of daily life, and the forest felt like a place where I could shut it all out. I didn't realize how fast one choice could make everything fall apart. The trail I followed was narrow, weaving between tall pines and rocky patches where the soil had been eaten away by rain. It wasn't a popular campsite, which was exactly what I wanted. Most people preferred designated grounds with fire rings, picnic tables, even outhouses. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. I wanted to feel like I was far from anyone else. By the time I reached a flat stretch near a slow-moving creek, the sun was just starting to dip. I figured I had made good time, and I dropped my pack to set up. That's when I saw it. Near the base of a tree, tangled in dead leaves and half buried in the dirt, was an old metal tin. It wasn't shiny, more like rusted and forgotten, the kind of thing that looked like it had been sitting there for decades. I should have left it right there. That would have been the smart thing. But curiosity got the better of me. I dug it out, brushing away the dirt with my sleeve, and pried it open. Inside were scraps of paper, brittle and yellowed, with faint writing that had blurred into illegibility. A few were folded so tightly that I couldn't even open them without tearing them apart. I remember thinking it was cool, like stumbling across some time capsule. I slid the tin into my backpack, figuring I'd look at it later by the fire. The first hours were fine. I pitched my tent, strung up a line for my food bag, and boiled water for dinner. The woods felt alive with the usual background noises: wind pressing through branches, insects humming, the occasional splash from the creek. The air was cool, crisp enough that my fire felt like a relief when the darkness spread. But even then, I had this faint itch at the back of my neck, like something wasn't quite right. When I finally opened the tin again, I did it with my headlamp casting a weak yellow cone across my lap. The scraps were harder to read than I remembered. A couple of them had what looked like names scrawled on them, but the letters trailed off, smeared or washed away by moisture. One page had small circles drawn in the corners, like a child's doodles, but the paper was so thin it nearly crumbled under my touch. I should have put it away right then, but I sat there turning the pieces over until the fire died low. Eventually, I shoved it back into my pack and crawled into my sleeping bag. That was when the forest changed. I've camped enough to know the difference between normal night sounds and something else. This wasn't just the occasional crack of a twig or the call of some night bird. This was silence that pressed against me, thick and heavy, broken only by what sounded like pacing slow, deliberate steps circling just outside the reach of my tent. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, straining to hear. It wasn't an animal sniffing around. It was heavier, more cautious, like someone testing how close they could get without being noticed. I stayed frozen, my body stiff inside the bag, my ears wide open. Minutes dragged. Eventually, the steps faded back into the forest, and I told myself it was just my nerves. Maybe a deer, maybe the trees shifting in the breeze. I forced my eyes closed and tried to sleep, though my heart didn't slow for a long time. The next morning, I stepped outside to find faint depressions in the soil, just beyond where the fire had been. Not paw prints, not boots either, just shallow shapes, as though the ground itself had been pressed by something that didn't quite fit. I swallowed down the unease, told myself again it was nothing, and forced myself to focus on the day ahead. But it followed me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I filtered water at the creek. Every time the wind moved through the trees, I felt my shoulders twitch. When I hiked farther up the ridge to look for dry wood, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Something slipping between the trunks, gone as soon as I turned my head. By afternoon, my hands were trembling every time I reached for something. The tin in my backpack felt heavier than it had the night before, almost like it was dragging me down. I thought about leaving, packing up early, but a stubborn part of me resisted. I didn't want to admit I had scared myself over nothing. The second night was worse. I had rebuilt the fire, bigger than before, hoping it would drive away whatever unease I felt. But once I zipped myself inside the tent, the same pacing began again. This time it was closer, brushing against the nylon walls. My skin went cold. The rhythm of it was slow, steady, not frantic like an animal. It lasted for hours, or at least it felt that way, until exhaustion finally broke through my fear and I fell asleep. When I woke, the fire was nothing but ash, and my backpack was unzipped. The tin was gone. Panic knotted in my gut. I scrambled out of the tent, scanning the ground for prints, for anything that made sense. The soil was torn up near the tree-line, as if something had dragged across it. I searched every direction, calling out into the emptiness even though I knew no one would answer. I left that morning. I packed so fast my hands shook, and I didn't stop moving until I was halfway down the trail toward my car. Every sound behind me set my teeth on edge. I didn't look back until I reached the dirt road, and when I did, the forest was still, quiet, and ordinary. The tin never turned up. I I checked my gear a dozen times, certain it had to be somewhere. It wasn't. I don't know what I carried out of the woods that day. Maybe it was just a box of papers, left behind by someone long gone. Maybe the real mistake was thinking I could take something that was meant to stay buried. But I do know this. I've never camped alone again. The memory of those footsteps, circling me through the night, still makes my chest tighten. And when I think back to that moment, the moment I slid that rusted tin into my pack, I can see it clearly. That was the choice that set everything in motion. That was the moment things turned. Looking back now, it wasn't a curse. It wasn't anything supernatural. It was just me, being careless, ignoring the weight of what I didn't understand. And in the quiet dark of that forest, I learned the hard way how dangerous curiosity can be. I had always liked the outdoors, but most of the camping trips I'd gone on before had been small things. Weekend hikes with friends, a night in the woods here and there, some fishing trips where you stayed in a tent by the water. Nothing too extreme. The trip I'm about to talk about wasn't meant to be anything different. It was supposed to be simple. A couple of nights out near the mountains, some stargazing, a fire, and the quiet that comes when you're away from towns and roads. Nothing about it was meant to stick in my head the way it did. That night still comes back to me whenever I look up at the sky. I can't shake the memory of it. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't some ghost story or campfire legend. It was just one of those real, raw moments that makes you realize how small you really are, how fragile things can get in an instant. The spot we had chosen was a little clearing tucked at the edge of a stand of pines. Behind us the woods pressed in thick and black, while out front the ground dipped into a meadow that rolled up toward the base of the mountain. You could see the line where the trees started to climb its slopes, and above that it rose like a dark wall against the stars. The air was sharp with the smell of pine, dirt, and the faint dampness that comes after sundown. We'd set up camp during the late afternoon. 2 tents, a small fire ring we dug into the dirt, some logs dragged together for seating. Nothing fancy. After dinner, when the fire had settled into that glowing bed of coals that gives off just enough warmth without the smoke, I leaned back on my sleeping bag and stared up. That was the whole point of this trip, the stars. There are places where you can see the night sky, and then there are places where you really see it. Out there, away from town, the stars weren't just pinpricks. They were thick, layered, almost alive. The Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon, a pale river cutting the sky in half. You could pick out constellations without effort, but they felt drowned in the sheer number of other stars crowding the black. It was the kind of view that keeps you silent without trying. I don't know how long I lay there, watching. Minutes blurred into maybe an hour. The fire cracked quietly to my left. My cousin shifted now and then in his sleeping bag, but mostly it was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy. That was when it happened. At first, it was just movement. A streak, fast and thin, cutting across the sky. A meteor. I'd seen shooting stars before, but this one was different. It wasn't a little dart that blinked out in a second. This one kept going. It burned bright, trailing fire behind it, glowing so hot it looked like a torch being dragged across the heavens. I sat up straight without even realizing I had moved. My heart kicked hard, like my body knew before my brain did that this wasn't ordinary. The thing grew brighter as it tore overhead, moving in an arc that carried it directly toward the mountain that filled the horizon in front of us. The trail it left behind seemed to shimmer, hanging in the air like a scar across the night. And then it exploded. The sound hit us almost at the same instant as the light. A boom so loud it cracked through the air like dynamite, deep and raw, rolling off the mountain and slamming into my chest hard enough that I felt it. The sky went white-blue for a flash so bright it blinded me. The trees around us lit up like it was midday. Every shadow vanished. For a moment it was as if the night itself had been peeled back and replaced by raw daylight. I remember the ground seemed to shiver under me, a faint tremble that made the dirt feel alive. Somewhere up on the slopes of the mountain, a second flare burned for a moment before it too faded. After that came silence. Not the normal silence of the woods, not the little rustles and creaks. This was a dead silence, the kind where even the insects stop. I just sat there, stunned. My ears rang. My chest felt hollow, like the air had been punched out of it. My cousin's eyes were wide, his face caught in the afterglow of the light. But neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. When the darkness folded back over us, it felt thicker than before, as if the world had been scorched and then abandoned. The stars returned, but they looked different now, smaller somehow, less permanent. The streak in the sky still lingered, a glowing trail of smoke and dust that slowly unraveled in the upper atmosphere. It drifted and twisted, illuminated faintly by the starlight. That night, lying in the tent, I couldn't sleep. I could still hear the echo of the explosion, still see the way the mountain had glowed for those seconds. My mind ran circles. What if it had been closer? What if it had come down right in the meadow where we were camped? The force of it, the brightness, the raw power, it would have flattened us before we even understood what was happening. The fear wasn't just about dying, it was about how random it all was. We had picked this spot by chance. We'd laid out our bags, lit a fire, joked about the stars. And then something from the void above had nearly slammed into the earth right in front of us. Something older than the planet itself. Something that didn't care whether we were there or not. I lay awake until the fire outside had burned down to ash, until the woods slowly began to stir again with little noises. Even then, every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blinding light all over again. By morning, the world looked normal. The sky was pale blue. The trees whispered in the wind. Birds moved through the branches. It was hard to believe that just hours before the sky had torn open like that. We packed up our gear quietly, moving slower than usual, as if we were still waiting for another boom to hit. Before leaving, I walked out into the meadow and stared at the mountain. From that distance, nothing looked different. The slope rose up just as it always had, the tree line climbing until it faded into rocky cliffs. But I couldn't shake the knowledge of what had happened just beyond it. A piece of space, a rock traveling faster than I could imagine, had slammed into it with enough force to light the world up like day, and we had been close enough to feel it. When we finally hiked out, I kept glancing back at the ridge, half expecting to see smoke curling up. There wasn't any, just stillness, like the mountain was hiding its wound. Back home, when people asked how the trip went, I didn't know how to answer. Saying we saw a meteor explode near us sounded like some tall tale. But I can tell you this, I've never looked at the stars the same way since. They're beautiful, sure, but they're also a reminder. Out there, above us, things are moving huge, fast, unstoppable. And every so often, they remind us how close we sit to chaos we can't control. That night burned something into me. It wasn't just awe. It was fear, the kind that settles deep because it's real. Because it could happen again, anywhere, anytime. Because we're smaller than we want to believe. And that was the end of that trip. I'd gone out for quiet and stars, and instead I came back with a memory that still makes my stomach twist years later. When the night exploded over the mountain, it reminded me in the clearest way possible. The world doesn't care about you being comfortable by a fire. It doesn't care about your tent, your plans, or your little stories. Sometimes it just shows you how fragile you are, and it does it with light brighter than the sun. I was raised in a family where camping was never part of our lives. I used to ask my mom why we never went, why other kids got to go out into the woods with tents and fires and marshmallows, but we always stayed home. She would always shake her head and tell me that the woods were not for us. I didn't understand back then. It just sounded like she didn't like bugs or didn't like being dirty. But the truth, as I came to learn when I was older, was much deeper, much darker, and it all went back to one night in the 1980s when she went camping with some of her friends. She only told me the full story once, years later, when I pressed her about it. She had gone into the woods with a group of friends, teenagers at the time, none of them experienced. They had picked one of the most isolated spots they could find, on purpose, so they could drink without anyone stumbling across them. That isolation, which at the time had felt exciting and free, ended up being the very thing that made the experience so terrifying. When she told me the story, she gave me the outline, but she didn't tell it in great detail. Over the years, I thought about it more and more, and I started to picture it in my head, almost like I had been there. I imagined what she must have felt. what she must have seen, what the air smelled like, how the night sounded, and how her body must have tensed when things started happening. It always stayed with me, and now I understand why she never let us camp. If that had happened to me, I don't think I would have gone back to the woods either. It was sometime in the mid-80s, and my mom was a teenager, probably around 17. She had a few close friends who liked to sneak out and go drinking in the woods. That was the thing back then. You couldn't go to bars, you couldn't drink in your house with parents around, so the woods became the spot. It was private, far from roads, far from houses, and nobody would be there to tell you no. They carried their gear in garbage bags and old backpacks, lugging cheap sleeping bags, a tent they barely knew how to set up, and food that mostly consisted of chips, cans of beer, and a bottle or two of liquor somebody had swiped. They drove out as far as they could, parked a beat-up car down a dirt path, and carried everything by hand the rest of the way. The spot they picked was deep, far past the last sign of houses, past the gravel roads, tucked into the woods where there were no sounds except for insects and the rustle of leaves. There wasn't a real campsite, no picnic tables, no fire rings, just raw woods. They set up camp by clearing a patch of ground and pitching the tent awkwardly in the middle of it. By the time the sun dropped, they already had a fire going. They sat around it, laughing too loud, drinking, smoking cigarettes, throwing chips into the flames just to see them sizzle. Felt exciting, like they had escaped from the world. Nobody could see them, nobody could hear them, and the firelight bounced off their faces, making the woods beyond look darker, thicker, endless. The night carried on like that, drinking and laughing and talking about nothing. The fire burned hot, the smoke drifted straight up, and everything felt safe. It was around 1 a.m. when they finally started to calm down. My mom, who had never camped before, was already nervous about sleeping outside, but the alcohol dulled that nervousness just enough for her to crawl into the tent with the others. The tent was small, cramped with sleeping bags and the smell of smoke clinging to their clothes. The fire outside was still smoldering, casting faint light through the thin fabric of the tent. My mom tried to sleep, but the ground was hard, and the forest noises made her uneasy. Crickets chirped endlessly. The wind rattled the leaves. Every little sound outside felt louder when she was lying in the dark with her eyes open. At some point, she started to drift off. Then came a sound, faint but clear enough to cut through the background noise. It was the sound of something moving outside the tent. A shuffle of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, not like a raccoon or a deer, but slower, more even. She froze, her body stiff, and listened. The footsteps circled, faint crunches of leaves, one at a time. She shook her friend awake, whispering that something was out there. Her friend, still half asleep, told her it was just animals, that it was normal in the woods, and rolled back over. For a moment, my mom believed her. She forced herself to close her eyes again, telling herself it was probably a deer, or maybe even a bear, though the thought of a bear didn't exactly make her feel better. She waited, listening until the sounds faded, and eventually her body relaxed enough for her to sleep. When the sun came up, the woods looked different. The fire was nothing but gray ash. The tent was stuffy. The air was damp. Everyone was groggy, pulling themselves out into the daylight. My mom stepped outside, and that's when she saw it. Boot prints, large ones, too big to be from anyone in the group, circling around the tent. The ground was soft dirt and dead leaves, and the prints were pressed deep. They went around the fire, around the tent, looping in wide circles like whoever made them had been pacing, watching. The tread was clear, thick soles, worn down at the edges. These weren't hunting boots or hiking boots. They looked like work boots, the kind someone would wear every day. The prints came in from the woods. They circled. Then they left, heading back into the woods in the same direction. The group followed them only a short distance before they disappeared into the foliage and roots. The forest floor was too cluttered to trace them any farther. The realization hit them hard. Someone had been out there, in the dark, walking circles around them while they slept. Not animals, not some random noise, person, and not one of them. They had all been in the tent together. The mood shifted immediately. The excitement from the night before was gone. The woods didn't feel like freedom anymore. They felt like a trap, like eyes were on them even in daylight. They were supposed to stay for a week, but nobody wanted to. They packed their bags in silence, stuffing things into backpacks, stamping out what was left of the fire, and hauling everything back to the car. On the way out, my mom couldn't stop thinking about it. Every crack of a branch made her jump. Every shadow in the trees looked like a figure standing still, watching. She kept looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone following them. When they got home, she told me she couldn't shake it. The image of those boot prints burned into her head. Big, heavy, circling like a predator. She thought about how close the person had been, how thin the fabric of the tent was, how all that separated her from whoever it was a zipper and a thin sheet of nylon. She never went camping again after that. And she never let us go either. She said that once you've seen proof of someone creeping around your tent in the middle of the night, you realize just how vulnerable you really are out there. It wasn't about animals or weather or getting lost. It was about people. People were the real danger. Over the years, she heard stories. Other groups had found the same thing. Boot prints around their campsites, circling, then vanishing back into the woods. No one was ever caught. Nobody ever found out who it was or what they wanted. But whoever it was, they came back more than once. And that was enough for her to decide that her kids would never spend a night in the woods. That's the story she told me, and I believe her. Every time I picture it, I feel the same unease she must have felt. The thought of being asleep while someone stands just a few feet away, circling, watching, knowing they could do anything they wanted, and you would never even know until it was too late. That's what scared her the most, and that's what sticks with me even now. That one night in the 1980s was enough to change the course of her life, and by extension, mine. That's why we never camped, and that's why I never will.